I remember that evening in Jericho with the kind of softened clarity that comes only when the mind has grown tired of correcting itself. The sun had already slipped behind the back of the old terraces, leaving the streets in that peculiar half-light I have always associated with moments when one becomes painfully aware of age, regret, and the small, unalterable decisions that have brought one to a particular pavement at a particular hour. I had no destination in mind. I seldom do on days when the city feels like a story I once read too quickly and never fully understood. Jericho has a way of performing its own quiet theater. The narrow lanes carried the smell of old brick and wet bark, the slight sweetness of crushed apples underfoot, and the distant hum of bicycles threading their way homeward. I allowed myself the aimless pleasure of drifting toward the canal. The water was indifferent as ever, carrying a few drifting leaves with the steady purpose I often wished for myself. I heard the festival before I saw it. A thin line of music, something folkish and uncertain, floated across the water. A cluster of tents appeared between the trees, lit by strings of uneven bulbs that made the dusk feel more fragile than festive. Jericho's annual harvest gathering. I had forgotten it existed, though perhaps that forgetting had been deliberate. I have never been entirely comfortable around manufactured cheer. A small cider stall stood slightly apart from the others, as though preferring solitude. The paint was peeling in the modest way of things that have served long past their intended life. A handwritten sign hung above the counter, announcing some rustic blend in an enthusiastic scrawl. It took me a moment to notice the error. A poet's name misspelled, the kind of slip most people would forgive instantly. But I knew the line it referenced and felt the wrongness land with the faintest tap against my consciousness, like the quiet clink of a glass set down too firmly. Not important, I told myself. And yet, a young woman stood beside the stall, laughing softly at something the vendor muttered. There was an unmistakable heaviness beneath her amusement, a kind of inward flinch that she tried to bury beneath politeness. Oxford is full of such faces, the ones that smile because they believe collapse is impolite. She caught me looking and nodded in that small Jericho way, neither friendly nor dismissive, simply acknowledging another lost traveler of the twilight. I ordered a small cup of cider, though I have never been fond of the drink. The vendor commented in a tone that invited no reply that the recipe had been revived from an older Jericho orchard that no longer existed. I tasted it, sharp, faintly bitter, and carrying an afterthought of sweetness that arrived too late to matter. I wondered whether age had simply made me impatient with sweetness in general. A breeze passed over the canal's surface, carrying with it a brief chill. I watched the bulbs flicker above the stall, their pale, trembling reflections dissolving in the darkening water. A glass left half full on the counter caught my eye. A small, abandoned gesture, as though someone had stepped away mid-thought and not returned. These things often mean nothing. Yet I have learned that meaning and nothingness are sometimes indistinguishable until much later. The young woman's laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a contemplative silence. She touched her wrist absent-mindedly, then excused herself with a murmured farewell that sounded more like an apology to no one in particular. I watched her melt into the shadows between two stalls, moving with the posture of someone who has recently made a choice they are no longer certain of. I finished the cider, out of stubbornness more than pleasure, and placed the empty cup beside the abandoned one. Two unfinished moments waiting for someone who would never return to reclaim them. The misspelled poet's name lingered in my thoughts. A small thing. Almost nothing. But I have lived long enough to know that the city's darkest stories often begin with something so trivial, one mistakes it for irrelevant. I left the festival and walked back toward the canal, letting the evening close quietly behind me. I did not yet know that the first crack in the case had just spoken its name in crooked letters above a humble cider stall. I reached the station earlier than usual the next morning, though I doubt it was intention rather than the restlessness that comes when a night fails to do its job. Sleep had been thin, as though the mind refused to place itself neatly into any ordered drawer. The memory of the cider stall lingered, not urgently, but with that peculiar persistence of an image that knows it will matter eventually. I told myself it was nothing. I rarely believe myself. Lewis arrived with the expression of a man who had read something unhelpful before breakfast. There's a kind of heaviness he carries when he has news he'd rather someone else were responsible for, and he murmured that a body had been found near the canal. Collapsed, he said, not drowned. A passer-by had assumed the man had simply fallen ill. The ambulance crew noted the cider cup beside him. That was when Lewis said my name in that uncertain way that meant he expected me to connect a thread he hadn't yet noticed. The deceased was Adrian Loxley, retired classics tutor from St. Sepulchre's College. A gentle scholar by reputation. Not the sort of man who ought to find himself lying beside the canal on a cold morning with an empty cup near his hand. Lewis added that the police surgeon suspected heart failure, though he delivered it with the tone of someone who didn't quite trust the neatness of the phrase. I felt the smallest shift inside me, the kind that doesn't reveal whether it's dread or recognition. I asked Lewis the obvious question, whether the cider had come from the Jericho festival. He said it probably had. He asked me if I'd attended it myself. I admitted I'd walked through briefly. He asked if anything seemed out of place. Only a misspelled poet's name, I said, and I saw the confusion flicker through him for a moment before he dismissed it as one of my eccentricities. But I have learned that carelessness in words often hides carelessness elsewhere. We walked toward the canal together. The path was still damp from the night's rain, and the city carried that peculiar Monday morning quiet in which the world seems unsure whether it wishes to wake fully. A thin mist hovered above the water, softening the edges of everything, including, I suspected, the truth. The place where Loxley had collapsed was unremarkable, save for a faint indentation in the grass and the cider cup now sealed in a plastic bag. Something about the placement of the cup bothered me. It wasn't near the hand, but slightly behind it, as though dropped, not at the moment of collapse, but after a step had already been taken. A trivial detail, perhaps, but the trivial is often the hinge on which the larger doors turn. Lewis remarked that Loxley hadn't been carrying anything else. No bag, no books, nothing to suggest he had intended a long walk. I thought of the type of tutor who clings to his papers like armor. Loxley, if I remembered correctly, had always been that sort. Why no bag? Why only the cup? Why choose cider at all when he had been known for tea so strong it could outstare a prison officer? The questions didn't form conclusions. They sat quietly, nudging. The college porter had identified him from his wallet, which still contained a folded list of Latin phrases. Lewis assumed it was some private revision exercise. I didn't. Loxley had retired. What need had he to rehearse lines he had taught for 40 years? I slipped the sheet into my coat, telling Lewis I'd look at it later. A barge passed us slowly, its engine muttering in that tired, patient way I've always associated with men who work alone. The boatman nodded, not out of politeness, but because the canal demands it. I watched the ripples dissolve behind the boat, erasing all sign it had been there at all. I wondered if Loxley had believed his own life would leave so little trace. We turned back toward the station, and I found myself glancing once more at the mist, thin as breath over the water. Something had settled into me by then. Not certainty, merely suspicion. The cider, the cup, the misquoted poet. 3 small notes forming the first hint of a tune I knew I would soon be unable to stop hearing. I've always disliked entering a college in the morning. There is a kind of forced brightness to the stone at that hour, an eagerness to appear dignified, as though the buildings themselves fear being caught in their private disrepair. St. Sepulchre's felt particularly defensive that day, its quadrangles too polished, its silence too rehearsed. Lewis remarked that it looked peaceful. Peace, I thought, is often the first mask one learns to distrust. The porter led us through a corridor lined with portraits of tutors whose expressions suggested varying degrees of disappointment with the modern world. Locksley's face was absent from the walls, though I sensed him in the air, faintly, like the after-smell of chalk on a sleeve. I remembered him as a quiet scholar, the sort who corrected a misused Latin phrase with the delicacy of a man brushing lint from a friend's coat. His death should not have brought us there, but the world rarely asks permission before unraveling. We were shown into a modest common room where 3 tutors waited, each wearing a different flavor of unease. Dr. Miriam Halden, seated nearest the window, held her hands together in a manner that suggested both discipline and fear of what discipline might cost. Professor Julian Arkwright leaned back with a cultivated ease that tried too hard not to be noticed. And Rowan Pierce, the youngest, looked as though he resented every moment stolen from whatever argument he had intended to be fighting that morning. Lewis began gently, as he always does. He asked about Locksley's recent behavior, whether he had seemed troubled, whether anyone knew why he might have been near the canal. They replied in short, neat fragments, each polishing their words before offering them. Holden said he kept to himself. Arkwright said he had always been eccentric. Pierce said the world was full of people who died without offering explanations. It was when Holden mentioned Locksley's love of classical poetry that I felt the first faint twinge of something off-key. She described a line he used to recite to his students, only she gave the wording slightly incorrect. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but it was the same error as the cider stall sign. A coincidence, perhaps. But the mind rarely places 2 errors in the same drawer unless they belong there. Arkwright, sensing perhaps that silence might cast suspicion, launched into a polite monologue about Locksley's brilliance, his commitment to his students, his declining health, his reluctance to seek help. The performance felt polished, as though rehearsed in the mirror that morning. He even allowed himself a reflective pause, the sort a sentimental man uses to show depth. It rang hollow. People who truly grieve seldom narrate their sorrow with such clarity. Pierce, by contrast, seemed to bristle whenever Locksley's name reappeared. His answers were defensive, sharpened slightly at the edges. He admitted that he and Locksley had disagreed on academic policy. Disagreements, he muttered, are hardly grounds for suspicion. The mutter carried a slight tremor, though whether it was anger or guilt, I couldn't yet tell. I asked about Locksley's last term at the college. Arkwright answered too quickly. Holden answered too quietly. Pierce didn't answer at all. 3 different types of knowledge, none of them clean. As we prepared to leave, I noticed a crossword puzzle lying half-complete on a side table. 1 clue had been circled, a truth concealed in plain sight on 7. The answer space was blank. I found myself staring at it longer than necessary. Something about the clue echoed the morning's conversations. The careful omissions, the delicate phrasing, the shared reluctance to reveal what each undoubtedly knew. I made a mental note of the number 7. Some patterns prefer to announce themselves early. We stepped back into the quadrangle. Lewis exhaled the way a man does when a room has asked more questions of him than he wished to hear. He said he didn't trust any of them. I said trust was rarely the point. People reveal themselves not through honesty, but through the things they hope no one is examining. As we left St. Sepulchre's, I felt the first meaningful weight of the case settle on my shoulders. Not certainty, not even suspicion, but the quiet knowledge that the truth had already spoken somewhere in those conversations. Only its language remained to be deciphered. I've kept many small objects from investigations over the years, not out of sentiment, but because the tiniest artifacts often speak with the clearest voices. The cider ticket Lewis found in Locksley's jacket was one of those reluctant narrators. It lay on my desk that afternoon, its rough paper still faintly scented with apples, the ink slightly smudged as though pressed by a hesitant hand. A time-stamp sat in the corner, recording a moment neither of us could yet interpret. Lewis had placed it there with the quiet pride of a man who believes he has found something meaningful. He asked whether it mattered that Locksley had attended the Jericho festival at all. I told him that men seldom wander into festivals by accident. There is always a motive, even when it hides behind whim or loneliness. And Locksley, as far as I remembered, had never been a man of whims. I turned the ticket over. At first glance it revealed nothing. Then, faintly, in pencil barely visible, I noticed 2 small letters. Ask M. The writing seemed hurried, as though the message had been added while the ticket already rested in Locksley's palm. Lewis immediately assumed it referred to Dr. Miriam Holden. The thought was too convenient, too eager, too much like a theory that fits before it has earned the right. I told him we would keep the possibility in mind without allowing it to settle. We drove back to St. Sepulchre's. The weather had begun to turn, the kind of reluctant rain Oxford specializes in, droplets falling with the hesitancy of people entering a room they feel uninvited to. The college appeared slightly altered from the day before, though nothing tangible had changed. Sometimes knowledge itself reshapes a landscape. Locksley's rooms were on the upper floor of an older wing. The staircase groaned beneath our steps like something waking from a long sleep. His door had already been unlocked for us. The air inside carried that familiar academic scent, dried ink, old paper, and the muted anxiety of a life lived in books. The room was neat, but not obsessively so. I have always distrusted rooms that look too perfect. They tend to lie. This room did not lie. It merely kept its silence. Lewis sifted through a stack of letters while I examined the desk. Among Locksley's belongings was an annotated volume of Latin verse, the margin crowded with notes in his tight, meticulous handwriting. One page, however, had been removed. Not torn exactly. Carefully cut, as though its absence were deliberate rather than impulsive. I felt a slow tightening in my chest. People tear pages in anger. They cut them in fear. Lewis called me over to a small table where he had found an envelope dated the day before Locksley died. It was unopened. He handed it to me with the politeness of someone asking permission to intrude upon a private confession. The handwriting was elegant, perhaps trying too hard not to be recognized. I weighed the envelope in my hand. Too light for anything substantial, too heavy for an empty gesture. I slipped it into my coat without comment. Some things reveal themselves only at the right moment. As we left the room, I paused. Something had nudged the edge of my memory, a tiny detail from the previous day, though it refused to present itself fully. I felt the frustration of a man remembering a tune, but not the words. The cider ticket's timestamp, the woman at the stall, the misspelled poet, 3 loose strings, none yet willing to knot themselves. Lewis asked what troubled me. I told him nothing concrete, only a faint dissonance that did not match the melody we had been offered. He laughed quietly, saying it would be easier if I occasionally spoke plainly. I reminded him that truth seldom arrives plainly. It arrives like the faintest whisper beneath a louder conversation. We stepped into the quadrangle. Rain tapped lightly on the stone paths, forming small mirrored pools that distorted the surrounding arches. I imagined Locksley walking through this very space, ticket in hand, resolved to ask someone, Holden, perhaps, or another M entirely, a question he had been postponing for far too long. As we left the college, the cider ticket weighed on me more heavily than its paper ever could. Sometimes the smallest evidence carries the greatest burden, not because of what it reveals, but because of what it refuses to explain. I've always thought that silence in Oxford behaves differently from silence elsewhere. In other cities, it is merely an absence of sound. In a college like St. Sepulchre's, it feels curated, as though generations of scholars have negotiated which truths may be spoken aloud and which must be tucked beneath the stone. Walking through its courtyard that afternoon, I sensed a sort of rehearsed hush, as if the entire place were bracing itself for a question it hoped would never be asked. Lewis and I returned to speak with the tutors again. He believed fresh eyes might catch what yesterday's fatigue had blurred. I believed the opposite. Tired minds sometimes see more honestly, loosened by the erosion of restraint. But I didn't argue. There are days when disagreement feels heavier than silence. Dr. Halden greeted us at her office with the strained composure of a woman who had not slept properly. Her room was a careful collection of books, papers, and the faint scent of lavender, the sort of catalogue one builds when trying to make a space appear more serene than its occupant feels. She insisted she had nothing more to offer. I told her we simply wished to understand Locksley's last months. Her eyes flickered to a stack of marked essays, then away, like someone watching an unwelcome memory cross the threshold. She said Locksley had become distant, distracted perhaps, preoccupied with something he never named. She paused then, as though weighing whether to say more, before deciding against it. When she spoke again, she repeated a phrase she had used the day before. He was always fond of the classics, always quoting the ancients, yet this time she pronounced the poet's name correctly. I didn't mention the discrepancy. People reveal more when they think they've concealed themselves. Lewis asked whether she had seen Locksley at the festival. She hesitated just long enough for me to note the hesitation itself rather than the answer that followed. She said no. Her hands tightened slightly, two fingers pressing against one another as though attempting to erase the hesitation by force. It is always the small gestures that betray the most. Professor Arkwright received us in his rooms with theatrical warmth, the sort of geniality that borders on apology. He launched into recollections of Locksley, painting him as a man overwhelmed by the weight of his own integrity. I listened without interruption. Arkwright's voice possessed a polished fluency that suggested he had rehearsed this version of the truth. When Lewis inquired about any recent disagreements, Arkwright's expression softened into that sympathetic melancholy people employ when pretending they have nothing to hide. He mentioned, almost casually, that Locksley had been working through old college archives, revisiting matters long since concluded. He said it with the tone of a man trying to plant an idea, without seeming to plant it. I asked whether he had helped Locksley with this archival work. His answer, "Oh, occasionally," arrived too quickly, like a coin placed on the table before the price has been named. Rowan Pierce was the only one who didn't alter his behavior from the previous day. He remained bristling, impatient, annoyed by the intrusion. He admitted that he and Locksley had argued recently about teaching methods. He said passion was not a crime. He said distance was not guilt. His words trembled with either earnestness or fear. I couldn't tell which. But when he mentioned Locksley searching for a page from an old notebook, I felt something small shift within me. A missing page, a room full of silence, a cider ticket with a scribbled message, threads, faint and fragile, beginning to twist together. As we departed, Lewis remarked that everyone seemed nervous. I told him that nervousness in a college is not unusual. Academia thrives on the tension between vanity and vulnerability. What troubled me was not their nerves, but the way each had tried, in different ways, to direct our understanding. 3 tutors, 3 narratives, none comfortably aligned. We crossed the quad once more. The rain had returned, tapping lightly along the cloisters. In its rhythm, I heard something like the echo of a concealed truth, faint but insistent. Colleges like this do not fear scandal. They fear disclosure. And as we stepped through the archway into the open air, I realized that the silence around Locksley was not merely protective. It was deliberate, and deliberate silence is never benign. I have always felt that an unopened letter carries more weight than one that has been read. A sealed envelope is a small, self-contained universe of possibility, hope, warning, confession. And once it is opened, all that remains is whatever truth it held. Locksley's letter, still creased from where I had slid it into my coat, felt heavier than the paper inside could justify. I opened it in my flat that evening, though evening is too generous a word for the hour. The shadows had already settled across the room with the proprietary confidence of long-term tenants. I sat at my desk and let the silence gather. When I finally unfolded the sheet, I found only a short poem written in a hand that tried very hard not to be identifiable. The edges of the letters were precise, almost painfully controlled, as though the writer feared emotion might leak through the ink. The poem spoke of memories stored like fruit in a cellar, of sweetness that turns bitter in darkness, and of Jericho. The word itself written as though the pen hesitated over it. No signature, no explanation, only 4 lines, each more ambiguous than the last. I read them twice, then again, the way one tastes something unfamiliar to determine whether it is safe. Lewis phoned around 9 asking if I had discovered anything. I told him only that the letter was troubling. He asked whether troubling meant important. I said trouble always meant importance, though not always in the way one hopes. He replied that Holden had confirmed she hadn't seen Locksley in days, and that Arkwright had insisted, perhaps a little too strenuously, that Locksley never confided in him. Pearce had said nothing useful, which in itself was useful. After I hung up, I read the poem again. A peculiar line caught my attention, sweetness that turns bitter in darkness. I thought of the cider, of the taste I had forced myself to endure at the festival, a bitterness that arrived late. Too late. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it would prove everything. The room felt smaller as the night thickened. I reached for the missing page from Locksley's notebook, or rather the absence of it. A cut, not a tear. Something removed with intention. I imagined him sitting at his desk, scissors in hand, hesitating before separating a piece of his past from the rest. People remove pages not because they are unimportant, but because they hold truths one cannot yet bear to confront. Jericho. Darkness, bitterness. A cider cup by the canal, her tutor wandering alone, and now a poem written with the precision of guilt or fear. A detail surfaced then, subtle but insistent. On the back of the cider ticket, Locksley had written, "Ask M. Lewis thought it referred to Holden." Perhaps it did. But the handwriting in the poem was sharper, more angular, nothing like Locksley's careful script, and nothing like Holden's soft loops. Someone accustomed to disguising their hand had written it. Someone educated enough to speak in metaphor and confident enough to assume the reader would understand. I found myself studying the spacing between the words, too regular for spontaneity. A performance, not a message, and performances always have an audience in mind. The rain began sometime after midnight, tapping the window with that irregular persistence that makes one feel as though the world is whispering. I rose, paced the room, and tried to imagine Locksley receiving the letter. Did he read it with dread, with recognition, with resignation, or did he place it aside as unopened as some people keep their regrets? A faint memory brushed against me then. A comment Arkwright had made about Locksley revisiting old college matters, old archives, old wounds. I wondered whether the poem's author feared the past rising from whatever dark corner it had been buried in. Oxford's history is full of such corners. I placed the letter back into its envelope. Some truths must be approached slowly, like a timid animal that flees if startled. But as I sat there with the rain marking time against the glass, I knew one thing with unwelcome clarity. Whatever had drawn Locksley to the canal had begun with this poem, and I suspected it had very little to do with cider. There are days in an investigation when every step forward feels curiously like a step sideways. Progress of a sort, but never toward the place one expected to reach. This case had begun to take on that slippery shape. Each new clue opened a door only to reveal a corridor leading back into the same quiet uncertainty. And yet, It was in that uncertainty that the first false pathways began to reveal themselves. Lewis and I returned to St. Sepulchre's mid-morning. The corridor smelled of damp stone and the faint echo of last night's rain, the sort of scent that makes one feel as though time is folding back on itself. Students drifted past with expressions of a seriousness they had not yet earned. I envied them briefly for their ignorance of how quickly certainty decays. Our first visit was to Dr. Halden. She looked more composed than she had the day before, though her calm had the brittle sheen of something practiced. Her wrist was wrapped in a pale bandage I hadn't noticed earlier. She dismissed it as a minor injury. "Slipped on the stairs," she murmured. But the explanation arrived too quickly, as though she anticipated questions no one had yet asked. Lewis pressed her again about Locksley. She insisted she had not seen him at the festival. Her voice carried the controlled precision of someone telling the truth while hiding a different one. I asked whether she recognized the poem from the letter. She stiffened slightly, then offered a careful no. It was the stiffness that betrayed her, not the denial. Emotion flickered through her eyes like a candle nearing its final inch, then vanished. For a moment, I felt certain we had found our culprit. The hesitation, the bandaged wrist, the tremor beneath her calm. Each piece fit neatly if one wished it to. But something was wrong with the neatness. When she reached for a book on her shelf, the bandaged wrist bent without discomfort. A natural movement, too natural for an injury, severe enough to alter her handwriting. In that instant, I knew the red herring had revealed itself. She had secrets, yes, but not the one we sought. Pierce was next. He was pacing the common room when we entered, as though chasing down an argument he had not yet had the courage to voice aloud. His agitation sharpened when we mentioned Locksley's missing notebook page. He muttered that academics were forever misplacing things. He said order was a myth people invented to make their lives feel less chaotic. Yet the way he spoke suggested he knew exactly which page had vanished. Lewis asked where he had been on the evening of the festival. Pierce claimed he had been at home marking essays. His voice rose, then steadied, then faltered, as though searching for the correct pitch of innocence. I noticed ink stains on his fingers, common enough for a tutor, yet the pattern of them suggested recent work, not the marking he claimed to have completed days earlier. For a brief moment, the pieces aligned in a strangely satisfying constellation. His irritation with Locksley, his evasiveness, the ink, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. But then, just as I felt the noose tightening, a passing porter mentioned seeing Pierce in the college library that evening, struggling with a jammed photocopier and cursing with the theatrical frustration of a man defeated by machinery rather than guilt. It was the specificity of the detail that broke the illusion. Real guilt does not leave such mundane footprints. 2 suspects, 2 possible solutions, both elegantly shaped, both too easy. As we stepped back into the quad, Lewis sighed that the case seemed to be dissolving rather than sharpening. I told him that false clarity is sometimes a necessary cruelty, a reminder that the mind must wander through several wrong rooms before finding the right one. A breeze carried the scent of wet ivy across the courtyard. I thought again of the poem, of bitterness in darkness, of sweetness turned sour. Red herrings, after all, are not meant to deceive entirely. They are meant to teach the investigator the shape of the trap they are walking toward. And somewhere in that college, the real trap waited, patient, quiet, confident that we were still several steps away from noticing it. There are moments in an investigation when an object, long considered irrelevant, suddenly shifts in weight. The photograph Lewis handed me that morning had been sitting in my coat pocket for days. A polite souvenir from the college archivist, offered with the offhand assurance that it might prove useful. I had dismissed it then. Photographs deceive more often than they illuminate. But that morning, under a grey light that seemed to pause before entering the room, I studied it again. It showed a group of tutors and students from the late 1980s, arranged with the stiff enthusiasm people adopt when unsure what expression best serves posterity. Locksley stood near the back, leaning slightly inward, as though uncomfortable with his own presence. Arkwright stood beside him, younger, sharper, already performing the ease that later hardened into habit. Pierce appeared near the edge of the frame, not quite blending in, not quite separate. And then there was the gap, a space where a name should have been. The archivist had listed every figure except one. A woman standing near the front, her gaze angled not toward the camera, but toward something just beyond it. Elena Marbury. I had heard the name once before, though faintly, like a line from a half-forgotten novel whispered through a closed doorway. She had left Oxford abruptly, years before her time. Rumors had attached themselves to her departure, the way ivy attaches itself to old stone. Plagiarism, a failed romance, an academic betrayal. None proven, all quietly preserved. Lewis asked why I was staring so intently at the woman's face. I told him that photographs never tell the truth, but they sometimes betray the lie. Her expression held a sadness that did not belong in a staged group portrait. And the others, Arkwright, Pierce, even Locksley, seemed arranged around her in ways that felt more deliberate than the archivist had intended. We returned to St. Sepulchre's. The corridors felt colder than usual, as though the building itself had overheard more than it wished to repeat. The librarian, a woman who spoke with the calm authority of someone who had guarded secrets longer than we had been alive, led us to a small archive room. Dust rose reluctantly when she unlocked the cabinet. I felt oddly intrusive, as though disturbing memories that preferred not to be touched. Inside, among the brittle papers and fading registers, I found a library book stamped with a date almost identical to the one beneath the photograph. A collection of poems, unremarkable, save for the inscription on the third page. To A.L. Truth sweetens nothing. The handwriting was elegant, confident, familiar in a way that tugged at something in my mind. The initials suggested Adrian Locksley, though the sentiment felt far too intimate for a professional gift. Lewis asked whether I believed the inscription mattered. I told him that truth, when it appears in places where it does not belong, always matters. He frowned, saying that the phrase reminded him of the poem in the letter, bitterness in darkness. Sweetness turned. I sensed the threads tightening. We asked the librarian whether Elena Marbury had left any records behind. She hesitated, then admitted that Miss Marbury had returned a number of books the day before her departure, including the volume now in my hand. When I asked whether anyone had seen her with Locksley or Arkwright, she paused again. College staff learned the art of selective recollection. She said only that the past was often kinder when left unspoken. As we walked back through the quad, Lewis remarked that the woman in the photograph seemed at the center of something none of the tutors wished to revisit. I said that absence often carries more weight than presence. He asked what I meant. I pointed to the blank space where her name should have been listed. People erase only what they fear others might discover. A small deduction formed then, fragile but insistent. The poem, the cider, the missing page, the inscription, all pieces that felt as though they belonged to a story that predated the present case by decades. And if Elena Marbury had indeed written the inscription, then someone else had preserved her words long after she had gone. Or perhaps someone had stolen them. Either way, the photograph had not lied. It had simply waited for someone willing to listen to what it refused to say. There are moments in an inquiry when the mind, exhausted by too many half-truths and evasions, reaches for something small, a single thread that refuses to remain buried. For me, it was the misquoted poet. A trivial error, unworthy of attention in any sane world, and yet it had appeared twice. once scrawled above a cider stall, and once spoken in passing by a tutor who claimed to revere the classics. I have never believed in coincidence when the educated are involved. The educated select their mistakes. Lewis had gone to chase down a registrar's record. I remained alone in Locksley's rooms, which still held that quiet, stubborn dignity of a life built on words. A thin autumn light filtered through the window, illuminating dust motes that drifted like thoughts refusing to settle. On the desk lay Locksley's annotated volume of Latin verse. I had ignored it earlier, too consumed by the missing page. Now I opened it again. His annotations were meticulous, but something else caught my attention. A marginal note referencing the same poet whose name had been misspelled. Locksley had written the correct version, underlining it twice. A quiet insistence. A man so precise would never have tolerated the mistake I'd seen at the festival, and yet someone had repeated it with the confidence of a habitual error. I remembered Arkwright's voice as he recited a line the day we first met. He had smiled faintly at his own cleverness, then quoted the poet, incorrectly, the same false flourish. Too ornate for chance. It struck me then. The cider sign had not been written by an amateur, but by someone who believed himself too educated to make an error at all. I closed the book. The room felt heavier. Outside, a bell tolled somewhere across the city. Not loud, just a distant reminder that time was moving even if truth refused to. I walked out into the corridor, letting the stone guide my thoughts through the long familiarity of its worn paths. In the quad, I ran into Pierce, who glanced at me with a resentment that had grown sharper since our last conversation. He asked whether the new discoveries had brought us any closer. I replied that sometimes progress comes disguised as repetition. He frowned, unsure whether I mocked him. He asked if he still remained a suspect. I told him that everyone remained a suspect until the truth decided otherwise. His reaction was too honest, too bruised, to belong to a man who had orchestrated a murder. His anger toward Locksley was real but unrefined, the kind of anger born of academic rivalry, not premeditated harm. I let him leave without further questioning. My feet carried me to the lecturer's wing, that dim corridor whose echoing floorboards always seemed to creak at half a beat slower than the footsteps above them. Arkwright's door stood open. Inside, he was arranging papers with a careful nonchalance that I knew, instantly, was an act. He greeted me with the polished charm that had begun to feel like a glove hiding something clenched beneath. I mentioned the cider. He claimed no interest in the festival, said he had no time for such frivolities. His words floated in the air with too much ease. He spoke again of Locksley, praising him in that rehearsed cadence I had begun to distrust. Then, mid-sentence, he reached for a stack of lecture notes. The top page bore the name of the same poet, misspelled again, with the identical flourish from the cider sign. A ripple of clarity passed through me. Not triumph, I am far too old for that, but recognition, the kind that arrives slowly, like a reluctant truth. I asked him, casually, whether he had ever volunteered at the festival. His hand paused on the papers, a pause too slight for most, but not for me. He said he might have passed by, might have offered help, might have spoken to someone. His voice reached for neutrality and missed by a fraction. Lewis's footsteps sounded at the end of the hall, calling my name. Arkwright used the distraction to turn away, but not before I saw the brief flicker in his eyes. Something between fear and arrogance. The misquoted poet had done what more elaborate clues would have failed to. It had revealed the hand behind the mask, and yet, as I stepped back into the corridor, I felt no satisfaction, just the familiar ache of knowing that the first clear truth is often the beginning of a deeper, darker one. There are crimes committed out of desperation, and there are crimes committed out of fear, but the ones that linger longest in the mind, the ones that leave their mark like an old bruise beneath the ribs, are the crimes born of pride, Pride doesn't shout. It corrodes. It settles into the corners of a life with the patience of a fungus, eating away at whatever it touches, until only the shell remains. By the time Lewis and I reached the cider stall again that evening, I suspected we were standing amid the remnants of just such a decay. The festival had been packed away, leaving behind only a few stray pieces of wood and the faint, drifting scent of apples left too long in the cold. The lights were gone. The laughter was gone. Yet the emptiness felt louder than the festival had ever been. Lewis commented that it was strange seeing the place so bare. I said that bare places sometimes speak more honestly. He nodded, though I could tell he had no idea what I meant. We stood where Locksley must have stood, ticket in hand, deciding whether to turn back or continue. The vendor's absence felt significant, though I doubted he had ever known the importance of the cup he had handed out. Lewis pointed to a darker patch in the soil, where the stall's water bucket had rested, dripping slowly throughout the evening. He asked whether I thought the poison had been mixed there. I told him it would have been simpler than that. The simplest methods often hide the deepest intent. The poem, the inscription, the misquoted line. They circled one another like moths around a single flame. And at the center of that flame stood Arkwright, with his immaculate diction, his curated grief, his elegant mistakes. Pride shaped him the way the river shapes stone, slowly, invisibly, and without mercy. He had built a life upon the assumption that he deserved admiration. Locksley, with his quiet integrity, must have unsettled him more than any loud accusation could. Lewis asked what I was thinking. I told him I was trying to hear an echo, without knowing where the original sound had come from. He said that was unhelpful. I said it was all we had. We returned to Arkwright's rooms, just as the college lamps flickered on, their pale glow stretching the shadows into taller, quieter versions of themselves. His door was ajar, though not widely, the kind of opening that suggests someone has just left or is about to return. I stepped inside. The air smelled of polished wood and the faintest trace of cologne that tried too hard to smell expensive. Papers lay scattered across the desk, as though he had attempted to tidy them and lost interest halfway through. Among them, a list of committee minutes from several years earlier. I scanned them idly until a name caught my eye. E. Marbury, recorded as absent with no explanation. 4 meetings, 4 absences. A vanishing performed in slow motion. Lewis muttered that we shouldn't be rummaging without permission. I told him permission was a luxury for the innocent. He sighed the way he does when he knows resistance is useless. On a lower shelf I found a stack of festival pamphlets, none fully unfolded. One bore a faint stain that might have been cider. I held it up. Lewis asked what it meant. I told him I didn't know yet. But stains rarely appear on objects a man claims no interest in. The rot had begun decades ago. A rivalry, perhaps. A betrayal. Something Elena Marbury had known. Something Locksley had rediscovered. Something Arkwright could not allow to surface. Pride does not forgive the threat of exposure. It defends itself with the quiet ruthlessness of a man who believes he has been wronged by the very truth he once embraced. As we left the room, the corridor creaked beneath our steps. Lewis asked whether I thought Arkwright had meant to kill Locksley, or only to frighten him. I said, intention is the last truth a guilty man ever admits, even to himself. Outside, the wind carried the scent of damp leaves and the fading sweetness of the festival's remnants. It smelled like something turning, slowly, from sugar to vinegar. The slow rot of pride. And I knew with the heaviness of a man who has seen too many endings that this case had reached the point where the truth could no longer remain hidden without destroying something else along the way. There are confessions spoken aloud, and there are confessions offered in silence. The latter always more truthful, always more dangerous. By the time I walked toward the Jericho Canal that night, I suspected the confession I was seeking would be of the quieter sort. Confessions shaped not by remorse, but by inevitability. The sky hung low above the water, a kind of bruised violet that bled gradually into darkness. Oxford has a way of dimming itself when secrets rise to the surface, as if the city prefers to observe rather than intervene. I could hear the soft hum of a barge engine somewhere beyond the bend, moving slowly, patiently, like a witness arriving late to a tragedy. Arkwright was already waiting near the footbridge. He leaned against the railing with an ease that felt carefully curated, the posture of a man rehearsing calm. When he saw me, he offered that mild smile scholars use when pretending they've solved something profound. I approached without speaking. There are times when words only clutter the truth. He remarked that the evening was colder than expected. I said coldness often reveals what warmth conceals. He didn't answer, but his fingers tightened on the railing. Subtle, but enough. Pride stiffens before it cracks. For a while, we simply stood there, letting the silence weave itself between us. The canal reflected the dim lights along the path, stretching them into thin, trembling lines. I thought of Locksley standing there with his cider cup, unaware that the sweetness he tasted carried a bitterness someone else had chosen for him. Arkwright spoke first. He said he had heard we had visited his rooms. I said we had. He said he hoped we had not misunderstood his papers. I said misunderstanding was rarely the danger. He exhaled lightly, the kind of exhalation that masks panic beneath civility. I mentioned the poem, the careful handwriting, the metaphor too deliberate to be spontaneous. I said it reminded me of someone accustomed to crafting ideas in layers, someone who believed truth should be dressed elegantly, even when it wounded. He said poems are often misinterpreted. I said so are motives. He glanced at me then, sharply, and looked away just as quickly. His eyes flicked to the water with an expression that might have been longing or regret or something far stranger. Envy, perhaps, of how easily water carries its burdens away. I mentioned the misquoted poet. I said I had seen the same error on a cider sign, and again in his lecture notes. A small mistake, but persistent. He said no one notices such things. I said some people do. The wind shifted then, lifting a faint scent of damp leaves and the last remnants of the festival. I watched him swallow, a small involuntary movement, barely perceptible, yet it told me everything. Guilt settles in the body before it surfaces in the mind. He asked, almost conversationally, whether I believed Locksley had suffered. I said suffering was not the measure of a crime. Intention was. He said intention is never as simple as investigators hope. I told him I had never hoped for simplicity. Another silence. He rested his forearms on the railing, leaning forward as though inspecting the dark water for an answer. When he spoke again, his voice had thinned, a man remembering something he had once justified too convincingly. He said the past holds people hostage. I agreed. He said some truths are impossible to resurrect without destroying lives. I said destruction is often the evidence of what should have been confronted long before. And then, without looking at me, he murmured that Locksley had always been too honest. That honesty, when aimed at the wrong person, becomes a weapon. I did not ask who the wrong person was. His voice supplied the answer in its tremor. He did not confess. Not directly. Arkwright was far too proud for that. But when he lifted his hand from the railing, I saw a faint stain on his cuff. Cider, or something like it, absorbed into the fabric. A small relic of a large truth. Lewis approached from the path then, calling my name. Arkwright straightened, expression restored, as though he had never allowed anything to slip. But the confession had already occurred, not in words, but in the quiet collapse of certainty behind his eyes. As he walked away, I felt no triumph, only the familiar ache of watching, A brilliant mind wrought from within, undone not by malice, but by the slow, persistent poison of its own pride. I returned to the canal the following evening, long after the college had swallowed its lights for the night, long after Lewis had completed the necessary conversations with those who preferred the security of procedure to the discomfort of truth. The city felt emptied of urgency. The case was moving inevitably toward its formal conclusion, yet I felt no sense of completion myself, only the familiar ache of an answer that had cost more than it revealed. The Jericho festival had been cleared away entirely. Not a single sign remained that the cider stall had ever existed, save for the faint indentation in the grass and a stray wooden peg half buried in the mud. The air carried the remnants of apples no longer present, a lingering sweetness that seemed to cling to nothing. Oxford has its own way of erasing what it no longer wishes to remember. I stood near the water, listening to the soft lapping against the stone embankment. A few leaves drifted across the surface, brown, curled, ready to surrender to the current. Among them floated something that looked almost like the green husk of a fruit. For a moment I thought of the abandoned cup on the night of the festival, a half-finished gesture, a half-lived truth. Lewis had asked me earlier whether Arkwright's quiet admission would be enough. I told him it was never the confession that mattered, but the weight of what it implied. He said the college would want the matter handled discreetly. I said colleges were built to protect their own. He asked if I pitied Arkwright. I didn't answer. Pity is a fragile feeling, too easily mistaken for judgment, too easily misread as forgiveness. The moon had risen by then, thin and pale, as though reluctant to illuminate the scene. It cast a faint reflection across the water, slicing the canal into two trembling halves. I watched a leaf touch the reflection and break it momentarily, a small act of quiet rebellion against the concept of order. Locksley, I thought, would have appreciated that. There is always a point at the end of a case when the mind begins assembling the narrative it will later pretend it understood all along. I resisted the temptation. The truth behind Locksley's death had not been a puzzle solved neatly in the final hour. It had been a slow unraveling. The consequence of loyalties soured, ambitions curdled, promises broken long before the cider cup touched his lips. A story written decades earlier, waiting only for someone to read the final line. I sat on the cold metal bench overlooking the canal and took out the poem once more. Its folds had softened, the ink beginning to feather slightly. I read it again, though I could have recited it from memory by then. Sweetness turned bitter in the dark. Truth fermenting where no one dared to look. Jericho as the place where old harvests refused to stay buried. A poem meant for Locksley, yet written for an audience of one. The man who feared what the past might say if given voice. Arkwright would face the law in due course, though I suspected he would wrap himself in layers of justification before he allowed remorse to touch him. I'd seen it before. Men undone not by hatred or greed, but by pride, that most corrosive of all the vanities. Pride demands not forgiveness, but acknowledgement, even in defeat. A faint ripple crossed the water then, carrying with it two small apples that must have fallen from a nearby tree. They drifted slowly, touching once, separating, then drifting again. I watched them until they disappeared beneath the low arch of the footbridge. Something about their movement unsettled me. A reminder of lives that cross briefly, collide softly, and part before either understands the significance of the moment. Lewis arrived just as the last apple slipped from sight. He asked whether I was ready to leave. I told him I wasn't sure. He said the paperwork could wait until morning. I said some things shouldn't wait. He looked at me as though trying to decipher whether I meant the case or something else entirely. As we walked away, the canal darkened behind us, its surface smoothing itself back into silence. The scent of apples faded. The city exhaled, and I felt, in that quiet, the ache of a truth I had long since learned to accept. Not every question finds its answer, not every wrong finds its justice, and not every sorrow floats. Some sink, leaving only a ripple, widening briefly, before the water returns to stillness.